like to take you through some of the core questions that we ask in Life Worth Living as a way of getting a handle on the big question and bringing diverse voices into fruitful, truth-seeking conversation. We start with the trio of primary questions. What these do is take the diversity of human life, the complexity of experience, and identify three dimensions or aspects of life, and then ask a big normative question about each one. So the first question is this: what does it mean to lead life well? This is a question about human agency, about our character, our actions, the way that we affect the world around us. We need to ask this question because a lot of what matters in life is how we comport ourselves, how we live, how we relate, how we interact with other people. That's the agency question. What does it mean to lead life well? If you think about it for even a second, it's not that most of life in the world is what you do. So much is given to us, so much is not chosen, so much is what we might call circumstances. And so we need to ask a second question. What does it mean for life to go well? In all those things that aren't really up to you, what's worth hoping for? What kind of circumstances contribute to a flourishing human life? Now, agency and circumstance, they make up most of the world. Either you're acting or you're receiving, you're being acted upon. And a lot of traditions of thinking about human life divide it up into those two buckets. But there's a third aspect that's really important when you're asking these questions about what makes life really worth living. And that's a question of experience, of how it feels. So we could ask, what does a good life feel like? This is a question of affect. It's not really about agency. You don't totally get to decide how you feel, but it's not entirely about circumstance either, because it's about your reception, your interpretation, and the way that the circumstances in the world around you affect your experience, the tonality of your life. Together, the agency, circumstance, and affect questions can capture a lot of our experience, what really matters to us in life. And this is one of their values, because if you ask them of a text or a tradition or of yourself, then you start to piece together a really comprehensive vision of life. Different people's answers or responses to these questions differ a lot. And they differ in two different ways. You can have different content for your answer, or you can relate the three aspects or dimensions of life differently.